chat as well. Bonjour. So I think that we can start. So hello and welcome to this fourth eMag on climate action in Africa. So today we're going to be talking about financing for losses and damages. I am María Lucini and I work for the events department here at Climate Chance. So for those of you who do not know us yet, Climate Chance is an international organization that was funded in 2015 that aims to bring together all the non-state actors that are recognized by the UN. So the 9 group of actors, including local authorities, business and industry, non-governmental organizations, etc. You all know them. So our 3 main missions are sharing information, which we do through our action portal. We also analyze climate action through our observatory. And thirdly, we bring together climate actors. And until July, we're going to be having these eMags, these monthly sessions to talk about climate action in Africa. Next week, we will publish a magazine with all the information that has been said in this session. And we will also share with you the replay on YouTube because it's a frequent question. So know that we'll share the replay. So for our session today, we're going to have a few speakers. And among them, as always, we have Mélaine Assè Wassa Sama, who works in the Observatory of Climate Change. He is our project officer for climate action in Africa, and he's going to present today his Analyses Note focused on the new fund for loss and damage that was announced at the COP27. You can find the full note on our website, and we will also be sending the link through the chat. Pay attention to the chat. This is important because all the information that we say, we will be sending the links through there. And after Mélaine, we're going to have Boris Ngounou, Afrik journalist, who will present some relevant news articles on the topic that we'll be discussing today, so notably the shortcomings of the fund. And afterwards, we'll have a wonderful panel to discuss around the question, what remains to be done for a fair and adapted financing of loss and damages in African context. For that, we will firstly have Aïssatou Diagne, a senior climate change officer from the West African Development Bank. And she's going to explain what are other existing funds that people can access, and also what are the next steps for the operationalization of the fund created at COP27. Afterwards, we will have Moumouni Compaore, a country advocacy officer for Oxfam, and he will present Oxfam's work in Burkina Faso on mechanisms and modalities for financing loss and damage to meet community needs. After that, we're going to have Seydou Ouedraogo. He's a representative of the Farmers Confederation of Faso, and he will be sharing his experience on the consequences of losses and damages. So I directly give the floor to Mélaine so that he can present us his note, and we'll dive right into it.
Merci, Maria. Bonjour.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, and hello, everyone. I'm Mélaine Assè Wassa Sama. I'm the project director at Climate Change for Climate Action. This afternoon, I am going to share with you some notes from the observatory. This is an analysis from the observatory regarding loss and damages. We are interested here in the various challenges around the new fund, especially for African stakeholders. Since COP27, we have been presented with a new fund as being a financial answer to the loss and damages of climate change, but this fund is also raising some questions for the climate action stakeholders in Africa, and for more generally for stakeholders around climate action, with the various steps, namely the various steps to in this process, before this, we might just look at what we mean by loss and damages. There is a first academic definition to define these loss and damages, which are damages caused by the climate change, representing the various consequences, negative consequences of climate change. Even though there are some mitigation and adaptation measures, there are also there are always negative consequences which cannot be avoided because we have waited far too long before adapting some measures. Therefore, these are consequences and damages following floodings, climate hazards, the rise of the sea level, droughts, for example, among others. We have identified two categories of loss and damages. And we have the economic loss and damages, designing negative consequences to climate changes that may have a monetary value. For example, when we talk about innovation, for example, the climate change has destroyed some houses, some infrastructures, so we can estimate the cost of these rebuildings of these infrastructures because these are huge amounts. Same with farming, crops and so on, we can identify or calculate the cost of this. The second category for loss and damages is what we call the non-economic loss and prejudices. Can somebody close their microphone, please? There is too much background noise, thank you. Because this cannot be evaluated economically speaking. For example, attempt to biodiversity, trauma, psychological trauma, or human losses following droughts or the destruction or the loss of crops. It is also difficult to evaluate human losses. So, of course, this is not something that you can calculate or give a price to. So beside these two categories, some studies have shown that the cost of loss and damages could represent between 290 to 580 billions of US dollars by 2030. And if we make it till 2050, we can estimate this to 1,700 billions of US dollars. So we estimate that 97% of victims of climate hazards, extreme climate hazards, are in Africa. Now we realize also that as part of the loss and damages, we could also identify up to 86 millions of climate migrants by 2050, and 19 millions mainly in Northern Africa. For example, Freddy is a cyclone that hits Africa recently, West Africa, which forced over 660,000 people to move away in Malawi. So we realize that this is something that the population are subject to, even though Africa is not contributing to gas emissions as much as the rest of the world, which of course has caused some reaction because they have asked for compensation for the loss and damages that they have suffered. And this started in 2007 during the COP13. For the first time, there were some discussions and reflections on these issues. Following that, in 2013, the COP 2019 with the International Mechanism of Vaso relating to loss and prejudices in order to strengthen the collaboration. In 2015, during the COP21, there was a first victory over the fact of the integration of loss and prejudices at the Paris Agreement, and therefore to act this to adaptation and mitigation. But there was a failure in that. This was not as the African countries asked for, but at COP26, there was another failure in that there was no funds directly relating to that as was asked, but there was a dialogue, the Glasgow dialogue, in order to continue to discuss the possible discussions, the possible solutions to make up for this. And in 2022, during the COP27, there was an announcement relating to a new fund for the loss and prejudices. So we can really commend this new fund, yet there are a number of issues which still need to be raised, some areas of confusion around this. So what do we really talk about here? We are talking here about the source of financing for this fund. Several options have been addressed. The first one would be beside the developed countries, which are already contributing to enlarge this to emerging nations, for example, India, China, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. But at the moment, these countries do not consider that they are not in a position to do so. Another option, which has been discussed more at length, was to actually to resort to taxation, to tax solutions. For example, taxes on fossil
Une autre qui est de plus en plus
on fossil fuels in order to finance this fund. Also to tax the extraction of fossil fuels. For example, 100 of those companies have issued a lot of the gas emissions. So the goal here would be to have a tax, for example, of $6 per ton, which could release about $150 million US dollars. These are various avenues of discussions, but nothing has been decided as yet. Another issue is the eligibility of the beneficiaries of these funds. For so far, all the developing countries are eligible to these funds. There are still discussions and debates going on. For example, there was some opposition from the J77 regarding this fund for the less industrialized and the most vulnerable countries. There was an opposition from China. Yet the issue is to know exactly what do we mean by vulnerable countries? What do we put under vulnerability, climate vulnerability? So this will become some other issue. Another question is relating the modality for accessing this fund. Nothing is official so far, but what we know is that there is a transition committee that is working on this in order to issue some recommendations, to put some structure around the governance of this fund and the various modalities for accessing this fund. So this transition committee, has already started working on this. There has been a number of meetings, one in March, in order to implement a new working group that will continue the works until COP28. Now, besides all this, or from those elements, what will be the next steps? What are the next steps that remain? Of course, these elements are still not clarified. So we have identified a number of points and events in the schedule. I have mentioned the transition committee, which has been given a mandate to define and structure the funds and their modality. So the first meeting already took place. There will be a second working group relating to loss and damages on April 29th and 30th in Germany. As part of this workshop, there's already been a launch or a call to study a number of cases or study cases pertaining to the financing of loss and damages. And I think there will be new call for proposals. Another key moment as part of this process is the Paris summit, which was announced by President Macron during COP27 relating to the new financial pact. This will be in June of 22nd and 23rd in Paris in order to discuss the fund and the new ways of financing climate action. Another key moment in the same period is the Glasgow dialogue, which I have mentioned, which is also another way of thinking and discussing ways to find solutions that will take place from the 7th to the 11th of June in Bonn. And then we will also have, during the same period, an intermediate session from June 5th to 15th, also in Bonn, as part of the negotiations leading to COP28. So we can see that the process is still long. There is still a long way to go, and there will be some difficulties, undoubtedly. Aïssatou will talk about the foreseen difficulties. What I have just presented is just a summarize, which you can find here in this publication, which you will find on our website. If you go to our website, to the Climate Change website, you will find under this tab the Observatory for Africa, all the various publications which we have already issued and the coming ones. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mélaine, for this introduction, for this wonderful introduction, and for contextualizing this issue. If anyone has questions for Mélaine, please do not hesitate to write them in the chat, because we will have a Q&A session at the end, and they will be very useful. And remember that the note that Mélaine has talked about is published on our website, and that you can consult it at any time. There is also another note written as well by Mélaine on the COP27 initiatives. The link of to that note will also be sent through the chat. So now we have a special segment, our special segment with Afrik 21. Bonjour Boris et bienvenue. C'est un plaisir de vous recevoir. Pouvez-vous nous dire quelques mots sur les nouveautés en matière de financement climatique en Afrique et sur les lacunes du fonds de la COP27? Merci Boris.
After the COP27, what has been missing? You have the floor. Thank you, Boris. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm going to present now we can't hear you.
L'actualité concernant l'actualité liée au fonds nécessaire.
So that's relating to all the updates relating to the funds for loss and damages in Africa. So regarding the protection of the environment, what needs to be noted first is that the issue of loss and damages is something that has been on the pipeline for some years. But what is really now an official note was issued during the COP27, which took place last year. During COP27, where there was a discussion around the loss and damages. As Mélaine was saying, we still have to define the various modalities and the various elements around this issue, and mainly the management of this fund in the coming years. In this respect, the participants to the COP27 developed or set up a committee that will be working on this and working on the various modalities of access the fund for loss and damages during COP28, which will take place in 2023 this year in Dubai. So while the world leaders are thinking about the financing of loss and damages following climate change, this phenomenon is highlighted even more so in Africa, which is presented as the most vulnerable region in the world to climate change. So the UN, more than 100 million, according to the UN, more than 100 million people will be threatened or will be threatened by climate change by 2030. So the UN, there's been a report, Climate Policy Initiatives, which highlighted the pressure, that put the pressure on the developed countries with a need to increase the climate funds or climate finance for the African region. So this document regarding this pressure was published in August of 22 in the UK, in London. And this document says or states that Africa is really marginalized in the world, and the continent only gets 12% of the financing that it needs to manage the impact of climate change. For example, in 2020, the African continent received $29.5 million compared to the over $250 million US, which were necessary, which were also stated as part of the contributions determined at national level. So in this report on the African perspective for 2022, the African Bank of Development was saying that the transition required a great number of resources, between $1,300 and $1,600 million that would be necessary between 2020 and 2030. This is necessary in order to implement climate action, as has been stated in the various NDCs. And this is what the National Bank of Development has mentioned. So a bracket between $1,300 and $1,600 million, the necessary part for the financing of the loss and prejudices in the African continent is between 289 and 400 billion dollars. These are the forecasts that have been given by the West African Development Bank. So they intend to mobilize, following these forecasts, $127.5 million per year with their different partners, national and international partners, in order to make up for the gap, for the deficit that the African continent needs. You know that Africa is really at the heart of all the debates in order to make up for the climate change. And Africa considers itself as a victim, or there is an issue of climate justice here. And the necessity to finance the loss and prejudices. So Africa is seen a bit like an outcast, but there's a need now to come out of this climate injustice in order to access better funds and more financing to fight against climate change and to adapt and to mitigate climate change in Africa, especially in the sub-Saharan countries of Africa. These countries are already under pressure. They are already struggling to get access to other funds for education, for health, for nutrition, meaning that this tension does not always allow them to find the necessary funds for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Boris. Hello, everyone. Again, thank you for the selection of articles, which we will continue to share with you. You will receive these links through the eMag magazine that will be published next week. So what you just shared, Boris, really shows and highlights what Mélaine was saying in his introduction. Yes, these funds, or this fund, could be good news as such, but it is not necessarily sufficient in order to meet all the needs of the stakeholders on the ground. So from there on, we raise a question of how much more needs to be done in order to make up for this. So we have invited a number of speakers to answer this question. We've asked Aïssatou Diagne, who is in charge of climate action senior at the WADB, coordinating the center in Lomé for climate. Aïssatou, what are the next steps that need to be implemented? What are the main stakes raised by these new funds? Thank you, Chloé. Hello, everyone. Depends where you are based. I'm not going to come back to the various definitions of what loss and prejudices, loss and damages is all about. Mélaine already mentioned this, so did Boris. I just wanted to talk about the fact that it's important for our countries to make the difference between loss and damages and adaptation. On the other hand, for the moment, we have been working a lot on mitigation and adaptation to climate change, but it's important also to understand that loss and damages cover all the costs of damages. Mélaine mentioned this, all the losses or the damages following loss of crops or human lives due to weather, extreme weather or hazards and extreme weather. Now, if we look at this and compare the loss and damages and adaptation, so adaptation is mainly to reduce the exposition of these lives, these populations and communities, and to find other solutions while implementing best practices, new technologies, or new infrastructures that will be better adapted. Mélaine mentioned what was done during COP27 with the implementation of this new transition committee that will be in charge of developing new finance modalities in order to implement this new fund. As was said, there are still things to be done. For example, there are still many meetings that will be taking place during COP28. And during the COP28, we will have to adapt these new arrangements for financing and to conclude the various works of the transition committee. But this committee will also have to take into account the various activities, the various discussions that will take place during the future Glasgow dialogues, even in 2024, meaning that this fund will not be operational straight away, will not be functioning immediately. So what I want the African countries to understand today is that when we look at what was done previously with the previous funds, it actually took a lot of time before things were able to function properly, meaning that this particular fund, maybe at COP28, it will not be functioning with a governance, with ways of functioning and available amounts, because the amounts are not yet being defined. So this will be a long process. However, what I have identified as potential difficulties for the implementation of this new fund is to first identify or evaluate the various vulnerable countries, which countries are vulnerable, which are not. This is mainly regarding the NDCs for the less advanced countries, the small insular countries as well. But what about the other countries? The developing countries said, look, we are also subject to climate changes, so we need to be able to access these funds. So when the time comes to distribute the resources of these funds, we will have to assess the various levels of vulnerability. We will have to also identify the loss and damages, the schedule, the scope. Are we talking about immediate loss and damages or prejudice or something that started many years before? These are elements to be taken into account that will need to be classified in terms not so much of importance, but in terms of impact. We will have to make a difference between loss and damages and adaptation. We will also have to evaluate the financial compensation. We will also have to assess the various ecosystemic services. This is what Mélaine was saying earlier on when he was talking about loss and prejudices in terms of biodiversity. This will lead to a number of issues for ecosystemic services, but how do we assess these various aspects? This is going to be another issue. Also, the way that this fund is going to be fed, which could be another potential difficulties. There are other funds already existing, especially the Green Fund for Climate Green Fund, with many resources. But will this new fund be challenged? People might be saying, look, we already invest a lot for the Green Climate Fund, so we are not going to be able to invest as much in this new fund. Is this not going to be an issue? So that's something that needs to be kept in mind as well. Now, regarding the various challenges and what is at stake, of course, there's a need for finances. There's a great need for that. Africa is only receiving 12% of the finances per year. So we need to have a special focus on this. And the people need to keep that in mind in the negotiations during the COP28, so that they will be able to negotiate this and have a greater focus. So we need to also focus on the generation exploitation of scientific data that would be clear and verifiable, especially when it comes to loss and damages. They will need to identify the levels of exposure. Then these elements, these data will need to be clear and verified. So the countries will have to identify the loss and damages, and they need to start doing this now. We need to learn from the experience of the other funds so that we won't be in a similar position, that we will be lagging behind, and that we would not have the necessary documents or studies, that we will be losing time or wasting time carrying out some studies. It's good to have this beforehand. So we need to really start now to strengthen stakeholders' experiences, to involve civil society, people from the private sector. We will talk about this later on. So these are often the areas of difficulties, because the stakeholders are not necessarily in a position to develop bankable projects. So these things can take a lot of time. This is what I wanted to mention mainly. Thank you. Okay, we have already mentioned the idea of the difficulty of accessing finances, especially for the African stakeholders and local stakeholders. This is a current issue which we tackle very often across sectors. What are the funds, the resources which are already available and accessible, etc.? Could you talk about that a little bit? Yeah, we may not have time to get into details, but just overall to talk about the three main funds. There are also bilateral funds which also exist. So overall, you have the first fund, which is the Green Climate Fund, which was implemented in '91 by the World Bank to help for biodiversity and etc. Then you have the Adaptation Fund in 2001. And it was in 2007 that the fund was launched officially. And it was only in 2010 that the first projects were actually financed. So almost 10 years before it actually happened. And this adaptation fund only funds adaptation. Then you have the Global Environment, or the Green Climate Fund, rather, in 2010, with the decision to create the Green Climate Fund. In 2011, there was the governance of the fund, Green Climate Fund. In 2012, there were the first meetings of the board. 2014, the various principles and guides for the implementation of the Green Climate Fund, and the first investments decisions and accreditation that started only in 2015, so almost 5 years before it actually started. And then in 2016, that was the first year of a complete implementation. So this is financing both adaptation and mitigation. So the main difficulty to access these funds is, first of all, the modalities, is to, first of all, have some project. You can't access these three funds without presenting some projects. You need to work with accredited agencies like the World Bank, the Western African Development Bank, only through approved organizations and agencies. And these approved agencies are institutions for which the procedures have already been verified. So the main difficulties for the stakeholders is to be able to write out, to issue some projects in English, if it's in an English-speaking country, which often is an issue, to have a good transparency in the financial and technical reporting throughout the projects. It takes a lot of procedure for reporting financial and technical reporting. This could be difficult. What kind of association, what kind of initiative, if it's a small NGO or a small organization that may never had to do this before. Another issue that we have seen is that these projects are often small size projects with Green Climate Fund. We're talking here about $10 billion project, which is a lot of money for a small farming union or for smaller projects. So it could be small and not necessarily appeal to these funds. So we need to think of wider scope projects that could involve different communities of cities. Also, there is a number of windows. Often people don't know about this fund. They don't know how to access these funds. So it's important to be close to the authorities, to the people who are in charge of this fund. They are the ones who can endorse the project. So we need to be sure that those projects will come under the various modalities and obligations, and also a number of upstream preparation work, which is rather costly. Sometimes people do this without knowing if the project is going to be approved. So there's a number of studies that need to be carried out, like risk assessment and feasibility. So this has to be done prior to the approval of the project, which is why the WADB has implemented the Fund for Climate, the BOAD, in order to finance all the studies, prior studies, before the development of the project and before the approval of the project. And another issue is the lack of technical capacities for bankable projects. So we need to really work on strengthening the capacities, building capacities, and see how we can support people to develop their projects. So these are the main modalities to access these climate funds, to be able to identify the approved agencies, to get in touch with them, to make sure that these stakeholders will be able to support the project leaders. Thank you, Aïssatou, for all these elements and your insight. For those of you who are in the UMOA region, you have the address in Lomé, which you can write to. We have talked a lot about all these things, such as a more inclusive and more just access to financing, and loss and damages, of course, are part of that. Moumouni Compaore, you are in charge of an advocacy in Burkina Faso for Oxfam, and you have worked on this issue a lot. And also you have prepared the various international negotiations, always in touch with the connection to field stakeholders. Could you give us a few elements, some insight regarding what you do to meet the various needs of the various communities? So hello again, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Very quickly, in Burkina Faso, we have 3 programs running. Our climate action is specialized in the construction and value chains. In these 3 programs, we have also a program to assess the projects. We are working for climate justice, and we are focusing on finance, on climate finance, and on loss and prejudices. Last year, we published 2 reports, one for West Africa, with an assessment of the climate situation in West Africa, and we're also publishing a second report on climate action in Burkina Faso. So very quickly, what we do is some advocacy work and information work relating to loss and damages. For the last 3 years or so, in our countries, there has been an issue with research and study around vulnerability, climate vulnerability, and around the assessment of the loss and damages that the countries have undertaken. So what we're trying to do is that we are trying to assess what are the loss and prejudices with the small farmers and small producers, to listen to their stories, to take their testimonies into account. Sometimes they lose some of their crops or because of the floodings. So we are trying to document all these informations, and from this we try to develop some dialogue framework to put these people into contact with the government, to give some context to the issue of loss and damages at a national level, and also to identify various ways of financing to make up for loss and damages. As you know, we are focusing mainly on two principles. There is a principle which is a fundamental right for us, and we believe that no matter what kind of financing, it has to be based on the historical responsibility of the developed countries. We talked about the difficulties to access financing. We think we have to always keep in mind the fact that there are people who are victims of climate change. So because of, and this is due to some actions of the developed countries. Another aspect that we are working on is regarding equity for accessing finance, be it the adaptation fund or GF or other funds. If you talk to the beneficiaries, they often talk about the modality, the processes for accessing the financings, which take a lot of time. For us, the future mechanism should be very much focused on, or rather should learn from the lessons of the past. So we are always using one example, which is the repair fund for damages caused by wild animals in Burkina Faso. This fund is very much focused on communities, because when prejudices or an incident takes place following some damage due to some wild animal, there is a mechanism that has been implemented in order to repair the damages, to pay back the victim. Often these are producers, farmers. So the future fund should be really looking into this as well and focusing on this to better take into account the local communities and to have a form of repair. This is a question of responsibility, and this has to be perceived under the axis of the repair of damages. We need to be able to assess the loss and damages in order to have a mechanism for repairing these damages. So what we do is that we organize some conferences to put in contact both the governments, stakeholders, and the local populations, with civil society as well involved. And we came with an advocacy note asking for a fund for repair of loss and damages, and also to take into account all the concerns of the communities. What we are planning to do also is to organize a national study that will be an assessment at national level. And this is often what is lacking. This is mainly what is missing in our strategies. There is also the upskilling and sharing between the various stakeholders to talk about these various focal points, such as what we organized in 22, the African Caravan for Climate Justice, which mobilized several thousand young people. So this is, in a nutshell, what we do in the Faso regarding loss and damages. Thank you very much, Compaore. Very interesting indeed, especially what you shared about listening to the stories, to the testimonies, and the importance of assessing these elements and to get the accreditation. And the Climate Caravan also was a beautiful initiative. We welcomed a number of stakeholders during our last summit in Dakar. And if you don't know about this Climate Caravan, find out about it. It was a great method. This took place in various countries. This was in preparation to the next COP. So we have mentioned a number of people who are subject to loss and damages. So in order to talk about this, we have now invited Seydou Ouedraogo to join us. I don't know if you're going to be able to take the floor. And if so, please turn on your mic. Can you hear us, Seydou? Are you still there? I think your mic is activated. Maybe, I'm not sure. I can't hear you at this stage. I think we have some issue
de connexion
with your sound.
Seydou Ouedraogo, il est représentant de la Confédération
So he's a representative of the Farmers Confederation in Faso, with whom Moumouni has been working around the issue of loss and damages, and we wanted him to be able to share with you his insight for repair, for psychological damages, human damages, as was mentioned, be it human losses or other losses. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to hear from him. I think we have an issue. I think this is an issue with his microphone. Instead, I think we will take this opportunity to show a short video that was produced by Oxfam on the issue of loss and damages. This is subtitled into English. We found this very interesting, so we will show you one video and then we will have a time of Q&A, and maybe Seydou, you can write to us in the chat if you can hear us, if your connection is working. If not, we will try another time. Sorry about this, and maybe we can do this again on another occasion.
Kusinthawa nyengo kuno kuti maona kuti kusinthawa nyengo kumatanthauza kuti mvula mphepo yakuntho ikabwera imaononga zinyumba, mapeto ake kumabwera mvula yamphamvu. Ndi mvula yamphamvu ikabwera kumabwera mafulazi. Mafulazi aja akafika kenako zinthu zimakhala zoti zasokonekera, ndiye chokudya anthu sitimatha kukolola mokwanira. Ng'amba ikafika ndi kuti nyumba muno timavutika kusowa chokudya. Chidachitika njoti ku 2022 kunabwera mphepo ya mkuntho. Itachoka mphepo ya mkuntho inazabwera mvula ya mphamvu. Munabwera madzi oyamba amene matchula kuti ana adatigwesera nyumbaso. Kubwera bwaso madzi ena achiwiri akutchula kuti Mr. Gombe amene ndiye anafika saizi kumalizisa nyumba idamangayo. Mudzenga munomo ndati data ya monga kugwa kwa zinyumba za anthu, kuluza katundu, mandawo panopo omwe munagonamo makolo athuwo, anthu onse anagona kumeneko panopo natha kukokoka ndi mbewu za kumunda za kudimba zidawonongeka. Zimene zidatha kutithandiza pamoyo wathu kuti kudya zinazo poti kunoko sitili pa ntchito timatha mwina kugulisa kugulana mwina tovala. Izizo zidamba kuchitikapo mwangati kwambira 2015 ndi 2019 2022. Kwathu kuno madzi ndamene akutivuta kwambiri chifukwa kuti kwathu kuno zitsime zake zambiri nzamchere. Ndikuti wani kunoko madzi ndiovuta. Ndinganakonda kuti akhale ngati kotheka atatikumbira adakumba chitsime madzi kuli mtunda kumadzi ozizirako kunoko atatibwisa mangati mapaipi ndikuti dyano tikhala othandizika pa madzi. Umene umoyo wawo ndikuona kuti ananga ali pachipsezo chifukwa kuti malo omwe akugonawo ndosasamalika komanso atha mwina kudwala malungo mwadzidzidzi. Ngale pano moyo wanga ulibe odesa nkhawa chifukwa kuti unoko wangotsala kuti mezezepa kuti mvulaso ithe kubwera ndisatha kudziwa kuti mvula ikafika tipanga bwanji.
Voilà, ça permettait quand même de mettre des images.
So this video really highlighted the situation of loss and damages and the consequences. We can hear some noise from your side, Seydou. Can you talk? Can we hear you now? Are you connected? Or is it just some false hope, unfortunately? Yes, hello. Hello. We hear you. We have followed with great attention everything you've said. We had difficulties connecting. I've listened to everything. It was very interesting to share experiences, especially in Africa. And Burkina Faso, which is highly subject to climate change and desertification. I can give you my view following some experiences in Mauritania and what it brought, what have been the issues, what have been the constraints. Just quickly, in a minute or so. We can't hear you very well, unfortunately. The sound is not good. We have developed something for, unfortunately, there's a lot of background noise. Maybe you could write in the chat. It would be easier to understand what you are saying. It's not clear. We can't hear you well. There's a lot of background noise. There's a lot of noise. Maybe you can write in the chat. Okay, other questions maybe in the meantime? Knowing that the interpreter has to go, so we want to thank her for being with us. Okay, there were different questions. Relating to access to climate funds. I don't know if our speakers like to come back to what they have heard of what they've seen in the feed of the chat, mainly around the issue of smaller stakeholders accessing funds. What can be done in order to help CSOs to access these funds? Maybe Aïssatou or Moumouni, you may have some elements to bring or some advice to share. Yes, maybe some elements which I've already posted on the chat, but there are many organizations which can help with capacity building. So you have to be in the field, a bit like what we're doing now, to be aware of what's happening or what's going on, to get in touch also with the Ministry of the Environment as part of the preparation programs. In some countries are also other aspects and other organizations such as Oxfam or the Development Bank. So I think you need to get in touch with these organizations. Moumouni, would you like to add anything to this? Yes, I agree with Aïssatou. We need to reinforce capacities, especially to help mobilize climate resources, which is what we do already in partnership with the Green Climate Fund. We also support dialogue, which took place at the end of March. To strengthen our portfolio in Burkina Faso. We continue our collaboration. We train stakeholders. We continue advocacy with the various states. There is an issue of allocation of climate funds. It's difficult to know how the communities really receive the funds, and also how can we trace these funds. So we need to be able to trace back this with the states, especially for the smaller prejudices. I don't think we should aim at subsidies or grants. If we do it this way, we will not be able to meet the actual problem, the actual issue. It has to go through repair, so that when a disaster happens quickly, we need to be able to quickly assess the losses and to implement the mechanism for repair, rather than try to access some grants or subsidies. In Burkina, we are planning on having a conference with various stakeholders to see how we can influence future mechanisms relating to access to climate funds and transparency. Thank you, Moumouni, for your answer. Another question from Charlotte from RFI regarding the blockage of a number of stakeholders. Would you like to take the floor maybe and tell us who you are sending this question to? Do not hesitate to turn on your mic, Charlotte. She says she doesn't have a microphone. Okay, fine. I will read your question again. Then the question was, how do stakeholders perceive the blockage of certain or barriers of certain stakeholders such as China in accessing these funds? Would someone like to take the floor on this? Please go ahead. Sorry, I was already writing my answer, so maybe I can let other people to give their response. Moumouni, Mélaine, Boris. I didn't quite get the question, to be honest, but if the question was about who are the stakeholders that are a barrier, it's not just China, actually. Maybe other emerging countries like India, and also we should take into account the developed countries. The idea of having a distribution as a modality is not does not concern all the stakeholders. there is an issue of liability, legal liability. So this is a point of pain. I don't know if I got the question right. I think there are still some headways to make. And we should not forget the basis and the basic principles, especially the polluting and paying country. We should not lose sight of these principles. I think this is what Aïssatou was saying. She mentioned that principle of the polluting and paying country, and this is not always very well perceived by those who are subject to loss and damages. Do not hesitate if there are any other reactions, any other questions.
On peut prendre les questions en anglais, mais il faudra juste qu'on traduise. Peut-être répondre. You can ask your questions in English too in the chat, and we'll try to translate it. And we still have interpretation, so we can take the questions now. J'essaye de regarder si on a encore des questions dans la discussion.
Just checking to see if we have any more questions in the chat.
Une question un peu pour vous.
I think that's a question for all of you, actually, for all of our speakers. What will be the next steps and next priority steps before the next COP? What should be done if we want things to move as fast as necessary? I don't know who would like to answer this first. I can. Regarding the priorities, there are several events that will be coming. The transition committee, first of all, that will be working on a list of recommendations, and also to clarify how this fund is going to function, how it is going to be governed, what will be the modalities for accessing this fund. So there are a number of working groups that are planned already and events. The second one is the Paris summit regarding the new financial pact, which Mr. Macron announced. This would be another framework to discuss the new ways of fighting against climate change. This is something to be monitored closely. Another main event, and that would be the Glasgow Dialogue, which will start in June. So that's another highlight. So it will really start in June until the next COP28, and then the Bonn conference, which will be the official framework for these discussions. If I may just add to this, as Mélaine was saying, most of the African countries are invited to these various events. The countries need to be prepared for this. They need to know exactly what it is that they want, what it is that they're expecting from this fund. So it won't just be the financial aspects, because I know this is what seems to be the most important when we talk about funds, but you need to also look at the whole thing. If you implement a fund, if there are resources, but you can't access those resources, and that's a problem. So we need in the negotiations to be able to talk about what it is that we want, how we want this to take place, and to direct the negotiations along those lines. That's what I was saying earlier on. We need to have some tangible proofs and elements to prove what are the loss and damages, to assess them scientifically speaking, so that we're not just talking in an abstract way, that we're not just interested in the financial resources, and then if we get them, we don't know what to do with them. So as one participant was saying, sometimes there is an issue of absorption of the finances which are given. So at the end of the day, the countries say, look, we're giving them money, but what are they going to do with that money? Countries need to prepare in advance. They need to prepare seriously before these meetings.
D'abord, Boris, ensuite Moumouni. Allez-y.
Pour ajouter à ce que vient de dire Aïssatou,
Just to add to what Aïssatou just said, I hope that the African countries will align, will work together in order to assess their needs, so they would speak in one language, one voice, maybe per region between Northern Africa, Western Africa, Central Africa, South Africa, so that they could get together to identify specific needs to their regions. So they could maybe spread out their needs at a regional level before going to an international meeting to discuss the various modalities to access the loss and damages funds. Okay, that's very relevant indeed. Thank you. Moumouni? Yes. I would like to come back to what was said, and I don't think we need to wait for the next COP to do the work. It starts now. Especially in Bonn, in June, we need to prepare ourselves. This is when we get an idea of what would be on the agenda of the COP28. So we need to start working on this. We are already working on this, on a finance strategy. We are trying to embark a lot of other stakeholders. We need to continue to mobilize people. We also want to launch a campaign based on the principle of the polluting and paying member. We are working with Niger, Senegal, Mali. We need to build capacities. Often, people are sensitive to what the stakeholders are saying. We need to be careful. We need to work hard. Thank you. Hello. I've posted a lot of questions without answers. So I want to take advantage of your presence and your experience. I'd like to also express my views. I would like to know, for example, there are international organizations such as Oxfam and others, but they need to involve also to bring on board national organizations, take into account their own experiences. When there are some audits, in order for things to work, for society to be involved, it requires pressure from your side, from the partners, from the funders, for countries and international organizations to share their experiences with the national organizations. We can't have access to funds, and yet at the end of the day, all we're seeing is poverty and difficulties. So if there is a solution, a recommendation, an advice, whatever that you are doing, that you put things in the order, in the right order. Thank you. It's a good comment. Thank you. Moumouni? Oxfam was mentioned. Now, regarding Oxfam, we are reaching out Oxfam Africa. We are in transition. Our office will be moved. This is a transition period for us. What I may suggest now is to work and to not prevent or stop the negotiation groups. We need the civil society to organize itself in order to influence the countries, the states, rather. When the African countries send the delegates, they don't always have the capacities to be able to meet all the stakes. So locally, we need to have an organization from civil society, a necessity to better organize the delegations, to better prepare them. The civil society needs to put pressure. As local stakeholders, you have to look at ways to collaborate with other stakeholders and actors to create platforms along these lines. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for taking part in this discussion. There are some very interesting messages. Unfortunately, we won't have time to cover all the comments and questions. We have only 2 minutes left. So thank you very much. If you don't mind now, we will take a group photo. If you can just turn on your cameras before we conclude this session. If you have connection enough to turn on your videos, and we'll take a group photo. And then we will have a conclusion, a word of conclusion. And we will continue the discussion via email. You will have the contacts of everyone, and you also receive this via email. Are we ready for the group photo? Please smile. I'm going to count down, and I'll let you know when we're ready. So 1, 2, 3, and go smile. I think we're good. I will now conclude this eMag session. We will show you a slide with the contacts. You can, of course, continue to write to us at association-climatechange.org to continue the discussion, and you can visit our website as well, where you will find all the various resources which we have mentioned and talked about during this eMag. Again, thank you to all of our speakers, to all of our participants. It was great to see you all. For your information, we'll have a side event online organized by the FAO as part of the Youth Forum of ECOSOC on April 25th. This is following some climatons which have been organized in some cities in Africa with some youth. This is an interesting initiative, those based in Africa and in Europe. On May 23rd, we will be present at the Energy Transition Conference, and there will be a workshop facilitated by Climate Change. And we will meet again for our next eMag session on May 25th to talk about mobility and sustainable transportation, electric mobility, how to make electric mobilities more inclusive and more accessible. So we will try to work around this topic. You can already register for this next eMag, and I will send you the link again. You can start registering, and we will have another webinar, and we will send the information once we have more details on this. Thank you very much. So these are the contacts of our speakers for today. which you can find here on this slide. You can also write to us. We are over our time, so we will stop now. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our interpreter. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Merci, à très bientôt. Merci.
Thank you, bye.
Obrigado, mestre. A bientôt.
Au revoir.
Obrigado a todos.
Merci,
Tchau,
à
tchau.
bientôt. Merci, 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 merci.
Merci, au revoir.
Merci, au revoir à tous. Merci.
Merci, merci, à bientôt.
À bientôt.
Au revoir.
Merci, à bientôt. Prochainement.
Merci.